Hey there, and welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're settling in with someone who's standing right on the threshold of a really fascinating journey. And that's you.
Mm-hmm.
Specifically, thinking about you as a university student, maybe just starting out on the path toward elementary education.
Right.
This is such a unique time, isn't it? You're not only navigating your own personal growth and figuring things out for yourself, but you're also starting to grapple with some of the foundational concepts that shape those young minds you'll soon be guiding.
Yeah.
You might be relatively new to thinking about big psychological ideas like personal ideology, or maybe more accurately, what our source material calls personal identity.
It's a critical stage.
It really is.
Yeah.
Figuring out your own direction while also preparing to understand and support the next generation's path. So the big question is, how does diving into the research on how people develop their sense of self actually connect with becoming, an insightful, effective elementary teacher?
Well, that's exactly what we're here to explore today. We're going to unpack insights from a deep dive into some key academic work. Specifically, we're focusing on excerpts from a chapter called Processes of Personal Identity Formation and Evaluation.
Right.
This chapter, it's from a really comprehensive book, the Handbook of Identity Theory and Research, and it's written by some leading researchers in this field, Lewicks, Schwartz, Goossens, Byers, and Miss Sutton.
So the experts.
Pretty much. Think of this as getting like a guided tour through some of the most foundational and cutting-edge thinking in psychology about how identity actually develops straight from the people doing the research.
Right. So our mission today is basically to make sense of this specific academic source. We want to pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge, the key insights about how people form, evaluate, and sometimes revise their identities. And we'll pay particular attention to the processes that are really relevant during the young adult years because, well, that's where you are right now. We'll look at different theoretical models, the specific ways researchers measure identity work, how it shifts over time, and what kinds of things influence this whole process.
Yeah, and it's important to note up front, this source, it primarily discusses identity development in adolescence and emerging adulthood, which definitely covers the university years, and it even touches on older adults.
Okay.
So the concepts and the research findings, they're really centered around these later stages of life. However, the foundational processes they describe, how individuals explore options, make choices, evaluate those choices, revise their sense of self, these are built on skills and experiences that start way earlier.
So even though the focus is older, the basics start young.
Exactly. Understanding these underlying mechanisms, even how they play out in more complex ways later on, can give you a really crucial framework. It offers insight not just into navigating your own journey right now, which is important, but also into gaining a deeper understanding of the complex developmental paths your future elementary students are just, starting to walk. We won't be finding specific classroom strategies here. That's just not what this source is about.
Right. Not a how-to guide for the classroom.
No, exactly. Instead, we're building your foundational knowledge about a core aspect of human development, really understanding the developing person and that lifelong process of figuring out who you are.
Okay, let's unpack this then. The whole idea of identity development, it can sound a bit heavy, maybe a little abstract, like you're supposed to figure out your entire life's philosophy all at once or something.
Right. It can seem daunting.
But this research, it sounds like it helps break it down into more, observable, understandable processes. It's not typically some sudden aha moment where you magically find yourself.
No, not usually. It's much more of an ongoing, sometimes winding and, let's be honest, occasionally messy process that unfolds over time.
Yeah, that sounds more realistic.
And to really appreciate the modern view, the one presented in our source, especially the Lutex model we'll get into, we kind of need to glance back at where these ideas first came from.
Makes sense. Start at the beginning.
Right. The concept of identity development as like a central task for individuals, it comes most strongly from the really influential work of the psychologist Erik Erikson.
Erikson. Yeah, I heard the name. 8 stages, right.
That's the one. He integrated psychological, social, and even historical factors into his theory of lifespan development. 8 stages, each with a core psychosocial conflict or challenge. Now, for Erikson, the primary identity challenge was the conflict he called identity versus role confusion. And he initially placed that most centrally in adolescence.
Okay, the teenage years.
Oh, yeah. But critically, he saw identity work as something that continues throughout the entire life cycle. It involves identity maintenance and revision, even well into adulthood. It's definitely not just a phase you complete and then, move on from.
So it keeps evolving.
Exactly. Erikson saw identity as multidimensional. It tapped into cognitive stuff, how you define yourself, but also moral values, cultural group identifications, social roles. It operates on different levels, both the purely personal sense of who you are as an individual.
Like your personality traits.
Sort of, but also how you see yourself fitting into the larger social and cultural world around you. That social dimension was key for him.
So it wasn't just about what you think about yourself inside your own head,
Yeah.
but really fundamentally about understanding your place, your connection within your family, your community, your culture, society.
Precisely. For Erikson, achieving a strong sense of identity was mainly about developing the subjective feeling of inner sameness and continuity, feeling consistent across different situations and over time.
Okay, so you feel like the same basic person today as yesterday, and you expect to be a similar person tomorrow, even if things change around you.
That's a good way to put it. And he described this whole process on a spectrum from what he called identity synthesis on one end to identity confusion on the other.
Synthesis versus confusion.
Okay. Identity synthesis, in Erikson's view, that's the successful integration, the reworking of all those earlier childhood influences like the values your parents taught you, school experiences, neighborhood norms, all that stuff into a larger, coherent, and really importantly, self-determined set of ideals, values, and goals.
So taking all the pieces and actively knitting them together yourself.
Yeah, into something that feels authentic and chosen by you. Identity confusion, on the other hand, that's the inability to integrate those influences or develop a workable set of goals and commitments to build a stable adult identity on.
Feeling scattered, maybe. Unsure of where you're going.
Exactly. Unable to make meaningful choices, maybe feeling disconnected between different parts of yourself. But the crucial point, and this really echoes through all the later research we'll talk about, is that Erikson's stressed identity is never truly final. It's not static.
Oh.
It keeps developing. It can change significantly throughout life because of, normal developmental shifts like going from university to a career, but also specific things that happen, life events, interactions with your environment.
So like starting a new job or a relationship or facing a big challenge.
All of those, yeah. Your identity is always subject to potential change, revision, transformation. This fundamental identity as an ongoing, dynamic psychosocial task is absolutely foundational to the more recent models we're going to dig into.
Okay, so Erikson gave us this big, lifelong, multidimensional picture, moving from confusion towards synthesis, but always evolving. That's a pretty broad framework, though.
Yeah.
How did researchers make this more concrete, more, measurable? Where does James Marcia fit in?
Right. That's exactly where James Marcia made his big contribution. He essentially operationalized Erikson's complex ideas, especially that identity versus role confusion stage, to make them something you could actually study empirically.
Made it researchable.
Exactly. His key insight was boiling down the identity process into two core dimensions that you could assess: exploration and commitment.
Exploration and commitment. Okay.
Exploration is that process of actively searching, questioning, considering different identity options, trying out different roles, thinking about various career paths, exploring different value systems, considering different lifestyles. The searching part.
Looking around.
Yeah. And commitment is the process of making choices among those options and then sticking with them, deciding on a major, adopting certain values, committing to a career path, affiliating with certain groups, making the choice, and investing in it. So, by looking at whether an individual showed high or low levels of each of these two dimensions, exploration and commitment, Marcia defined 4 identity statuses.
Statuses, okay.
Now, these statuses, they aren't meant to be rigid, permanent boxes you put people in.
Mm-hmm.
They're more like descriptive snapshots of where someone might be in their identity work at a particular point in time.
Gotcha, like a current state.
Precisely. So first, you have identity achievement. These folks are high on both exploration and commitment.
High on both.
Yep. They've actively explored various possibilities, really thought about different paths and values. And then, based on that thoughtful exploration, they've made firm choices and commitments that they feel are authentic to them. They've done the work, searched around, and landed on something they feel secure and good about.
Okay, achievement. Makes sense.
Next is identity foreclosure. These individuals are low on exploration, but high on commitment.
Low exploration, high commitment. How does that work?
Well, they have commitments, they've made choices, but crucially, often without much personal searching or questioning. These commitments are frequently just adopted wholesale from significant others, parents, family traditions, community norms.
Oh, so they didn't really shop around, just took what was offered or expected.
Pretty much. They haven't really tried out or questioned alternatives. They've accepted a path. They are committed, but the foundation isn't really built on their own personal exploration.
Okay, foreclosure. Got it.
Then there's identity moratorium. These individuals are high on exploration but low on commitment.
High search, low choice.
Exactly. They're actively in the searching process, questioning, trying things out, exploring different options, maybe deliberating intensely about who they are and what they want to do, but they haven't yet settled on firm commitments. They are, like the name suggests, in a state of active exploration, maybe a timeout, while they figure things out before settling down.
The searching phase. Moratorium.
Right. And finally, you have identity diffusion. These individuals are low on both exploration and commitment.
Low on both.
Yeah. They haven't seriously explored different options for their identity, values, or future direction, and they haven't made firm choices or commitments. They might seem apathetic, uncertain, or maybe just avoid thinking about these big questions altogether. There's a lack of both the search and the resolution.
Okay, so diffusion is kind of a drift.
You could put it that way. So those four statuses, achievement, foreclosure, moratorium, diffusion, they describe someone's current state of engagement with identity formation.
Not necessarily labels for life, but ways to describe where they are right now in terms of looking around and making choices.
Precisely. And Marcia's model was incredibly influential. A lot of early research used these statuses to categorize young people, mainly adolescents and young adults, and then investigated, what factors might lead someone to be in one status versus another, and what outcomes were associated with each well-being, personality, future behaviors, that kind of thing. It gave a powerful, measurable way to study Erikson's ideas. But as research went on, scholars, including the authors of our source chapter, started to realize that while the Erikson-Marcia model was foundational, really useful, it didn't fully capture the dynamic, ongoing, sometimes really complex nature of identity work that happens throughout life, especially after you first form commitments.
Right, because Erikson said it was lifelong.
Exactly. So neo-Eriksonian models started to emerge, trying to add more nuance and focus more explicitly on the processes involved in identity development, not just the outcomes or those static statuses.
More complexity. Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
How did these newer models expand on Marcia's framework? What was missing?
Right. They started looking at identity not just as something you form, but as something that's continuously maintained, evaluated, and potentially revised.
The ongoing part.
Yeah. Think of Grotevant's process model. He saw exploration itself not just as, trying stuff out, but as a complex problem-solving behavior. It involved testing hypotheses about yourself and the world, like, if I pursue this path, will it align with my values? Evaluating your progress and recognizing that identity work gets influenced by commitments you already have or even competing attractions.
Like what?
Well, like how a strong romantic relationship might influence your decisions about where you go to grad school or take a job, right? That existing commitment affects other identity choices.
Okay, yeah. Life isn't neat compartments.
Exactly. And Grotevant also introduced this crucial idea, borrowing from cognitive psychology, that identity involves both assimilation and accommodation.
Assimilation and accommodation.
Yeah.
Like Piaget.
Similar concepts, apply to identity. You're constantly taking in new information about yourself, the world, your experiences. Assimilation is when you fit that new info into your existing self-view. It kind of confirms or elaborates on who you already think you are.
Okay.
Accommodation is when you have to change your self-view or your identity structure because the new information just doesn't fit with your current picture. It forces you to revise your understanding of yourself.
So assimilation reinforces, accommodation changes.
You got it. And critically, Grotevant really emphasized that identity isn't just formed and done, it's continuously evaluated. You make commitments, but then you're constantly assessing how well they're working, how well they fit with your evolving self, and that evaluation can lead you back to more exploration or force you to adjust things. Then there's identity control theory from Kirpelman and colleagues. This model zoomed in even further, looking at the microprocesses of identity work, almost moment to moment.
Microprocesses, like day-to-day stuff.
Yeah, even finer than that sometimes. It's based on these cybernetic feedback loops, kind of like a thermostat. You're constantly comparing your perception of yourself, your current state, to your identity standard or goal, how you ideally want to be, or how you think others see you.
Comparing yourself to your ideal self.
Or to perceived expectations, yeah. If there's a mismatch, a discrepancy, you feel this internal pressure to reduce it. You might adjust your behavior, change your situation, or significantly adjust your self-perception, or even the identity standard itself. Again, the key is that evaluation and adjustment are constant, ongoing processes. Bosma and Kunin also added to this, defining identity development as a sequence of person-context transactions. Your identity evolves through continuous, active interactions with your environment and the people in it. Commitments, in their view, aren't just static endpoints you reach after exploring.
They're more fluid.
Exactly. They're dynamic processes that are continuously evaluated and can be changed because of that evaluation. This really hammered home the idea that just having a commitment isn't the end of the story. Evaluating and living with that commitment is a key part of ongoing identity work.
So the big shift here seems to be moving away from just explore then commit in adolescence towards recognizing identity as something you build and then constantly check, evaluate, maybe tweak, or even rebuild based on new experiences, feedback, reflection. It's a much more dynamic, lifelong picture.
Exactly. These later models collectively highlighted the limitation of focusing only on that initial formation phase. They pointed to the crucial need to integrate commitment formation and commitment evaluation into a single dynamic view of identity that unfolds over time. And that precisely brings us to the really comprehensive model at the heart of our source chapter. This is the sophisticated model developed by Lakes and his colleagues. They did extensive research, used advanced stats to validate a model that doesn't just use 2 dimensions like Marcia, but 5 distinct but related dimensions.
5 dimensions.
Okay, yeah. And these 5 dimensions unpack both exploration and commitment into finer grains. Specifically, they distinguish between the processes involved in forming commitments and those involved in evaluating them.
5 dimensions. Tell us more. This sounds like the core of what makes this specific research so valuable for understanding the nuances.
Okay, yeah. Here's where it gets really interesting and gives us that more detailed blueprint. They identified dimensions for commitment formation and dimensions for commitment evaluation. So for commitment formation, they kept aspects of Marce's ideas but refined them. First, exploration and breadth.
Breadth, like wide.
Exactly. This is the wide search for possibilities, similar to that initial exploration in Marce's model. It involves gathering information on various identity alternatives across different life domains, potential careers, values, hobbies, social roles, you name it.
Casting a wide net.
Perfect analogy. The source gives examples of how they measure this, like asking people if they think actively about different directions I might take in my life, or thinking about different goals that I might pursue. It's surveying the landscape of options. Second, for commitment formation, is commitment making. This is the actual act of choosing among those alternatives and enacting strong choices. This usually comes after that broad exploration, though it's not always perfectly linear.
Making the decision?
Right. Examples from the source include items like, I have decided on the direction I am going to follow in my life, or I have plans for what I am going to do in the future. It's taking that broad search and making concrete decisions, putting down stakes, choosing a major, deciding on a career, adopting values. Now, importantly, for commitment evaluation, they have 2 other dimensions that capture what happens after you've made commitments, recognizing that the work doesn't stop there.
Okay, what happens after the choice?
First, there's exploration in depth. This is different from breadth exploration. It's more focused, more introspective. It's not about seeking new alternatives, but about evaluating the current commitments you've already made.
Digging deeper into what you chose.
Exactly. It involves gathering more information about your existing choices, thinking critically about them, talking to others specifically about the path you're already on, or turning inward to reflect on whether this commitment truly fits who you are now. Examples provided are things like, I think about whether my plans for the future really suit me, or I try to find out what other people think about the specific direction I decided to take in my life. It's a focused re-examination. Second, for commitment evaluation, is identification with commitment. This measures that subjective sense of security, certainty, and how well your existing commitments feel like they're truly part of you.
How much you feel it's right.
Precisely. It's about the degree to which you feel these commitments resonate with your personal standards, your deeply held values, your core interests. Examples. My plans for the future match with my true interests and values, or I am sure that my plans for the future are the right ones for me. It captures that feeling of being at home in your choices.
Like it fits like a glove.
Yeah, or like feeling self-concordant, as some other theories put it, engaging in things that express your fundamental purpose. It's not just having a commitment. It's feeling that the commitment is an authentic reflection of your inner self, a source of meaning and direction.
Wow, that really does break it down powerfully. It's not just exploring or committing. It's how you explore, broad search, or deep dive. And it's how you relate to what you've committed to just making the decision versus genuinely feeling it aligns with your deepest self.
Right. And this distinction is crucial because, as those earlier models hinted, these processes are reciprocal, they're ongoing. They aren't just linear steps you finish. Think about that college student example from the source. It's so relevant to your situation right now as a university student.
Okay, yeah, bring it up.
So you enter university, maybe you're not sure about your path, you spend time exploring different possibilities for your major, that's exploration and breadth. You read course descriptions, talk to people, maybe take intro classes and different things.
Been there.
Right. Then after that, maybe based on interests or advice, you choose a specific major, like elementary education. That's commitment making. You've narrowed things down, made a choice.
Okay, declared the major. Done.
Not according to this model. The identity process related to your major doesn't stop. You start taking specialized classes, you delve into theories, talk to professors, maybe do observations or field work, think about internships. You're gathering more info and reflecting specifically on this chosen path. That's exploration in depth.
Okay, digging into the major itself.
Yep. And as you do that depth exploration, you're also continuously evaluating how well this major, this future career, feels right for you. That's identification with commitment. Does the content excite you? Do you feel a calling? Do you enjoy the practical side? Do you feel certain it's the right path for your future, aligning with your values?
Oh, the feeling it's part again.
Exactly. If that identification feels strong and positive, great. You probably feel more secure, motivated, you solidify your commitment. But if it feels weak, if it doesn't resonate despite your efforts, maybe that evaluation signals you need more exploration in depth to understand it better. Or maybe, just maybe, it pushes you back towards exploration in breadth, considering other majors or careers again. See the cycle.
Yeah, it really is like a continuous feedback loop. Breadth is the initial search, depth is checking what you chose. Making the choice, commitment making is one thing, but truly feeling it's right for you, feeling that alignment and certainty, identification with commitment, is something else entirely. And it sounds like the research confirms that feeling good about it, that identification is particularly important for like your overall well-being.
Absolutely. The source specifically mentions that identification with commitment is much more strongly linked to psychosocial adjustment. Think higher self-esteem, lower depression, lower anxiety than just the act of making a commitment itself.
Interest. So just having a commitment isn't enough.
Right. Especially if it was maybe foreclosed upon, adopted without deep reflection. It doesn't automatically lead to positive outcomes. It's the degree to which you genuinely identify with and feel certain about that commitment, feeling it's an authentic expression of yourself, that's much more strongly associated with well-being. And this model, these processes, they apply not just to chosen things like careers or majors, but also how people process aspects of their ascribed identities, race, ethnicity, gender identity being adopted, how they explore and evaluate what those identities mean to them personally, and how deeply they identify with those parts of themselves.
Okay.
And people use these processes differently too, right? Someone high in that rigid foreclosure status from Marsa's model might show high commitment making, but probably low exploration and breadth, and potentially lower exploration in depth and identification, because the choice wasn't really based on their own search.
This five-dimensional model really does peel back the layers. It shows identity development as this complex, ongoing negotiation between seeking possibilities, making choices, and constantly assessing how well those choices fit with your evolving sense of self.
It really does. And when researchers use these 5 dimensions to track people over time in longitudinal studies, they get powerful insights into how identity actually unfolds. The source talks about findings from studies like that, including one called the Eltide study that followed Belgian college students for several years.
So tracking people over time, what did they find?
Well, on average, changes across the college years tend to be gradual, not usually sudden shifts. And interestingly, the source notes that levels of these dimensions were already pretty elevated when students entered university.
Really? So it doesn't just start in college?
Apparently not. It suggests significant identity work is happening earlier, particularly during the high school years.
That makes sense.
Over the course of these studies, on average, commitment making and exploration in depth tended to increase steadily over time. Students were generally making more firm choices and also evaluating those choices more deeply as they gained experience.
Okay.
Exploration and breadth, that wide search, tended to increase initially, maybe in the first year or two, as students explored options, but then it often leveled off or even decreased towards the end of university.
Why would breadth exploration decrease?
The source suggests maybe as people solidify commitments like getting close to graduation, needing to focus on specific job applications or grad school plans, they naturally narrow their focus. Less wide searching, more focus on the chosen path.
Right, focusing in. And what about identification with commitment, that feeling of fit?
That one showed some fluctuation over time. The source suggests this might reflect that continuous evaluation process, maybe influenced by specific things happening like facing tough exams or making big life decisions, which might temporarily shake your certainty.
So the average path looks something like: initial exploration broadens, then narrows as choices solidify, while evaluating those choices and feeling connected to them keeps evolving. It might have some ups and downs along the way.
That's a pretty good summary of the average trends, yeah. But critically, just looking at averages hides the huge individual differences. People don't all follow the same script.
Right, everyone's different.
Research shows people follow distinct patterns or identity trajectories over time, which can be described using these 5 dimensions.
Trajectories,
Yep.
like different pathways.
Exactly. This idea builds on earlier work, like from Chaucelson, who described different pathways related to Mars's statuses over time. Our source describes several of these distinct trajectories identified using the Ludex model. First, you have the pathmakers. These individuals typically score high on all 4 of the key identity dimensions: breadth exploration, commitment making, depth exploration, and identification. And these scores generally increase or stay high over time.
The high achievers of identity.
In a way, they're actively, purposefully engaged in forming, evaluating, strengthening commitments. The source links this to developmental individualization, a proactive, conscious, self-directed search for growth, actively using opportunities to shape and evaluate their identity. They usually show moderate to high well-being.
Okay, path makers. Who else?
Next are the searchers. They typically score low on the commitment dimensions, making and identification, but high on exploration, both breadth and depth.
Still looking, basically.
Yeah, actively engaged in searching, questioning, considering options, evaluating tentative choices, but haven't made firm, stable commitments yet. Now, the source notes, for some searchers, this intense searching is linked to psychological distress, maybe connected to what's called default individualization, a more passive, reactive, maybe confused approach that can interfere with making commitments.
So searching can be stressful for some.
It can be. But importantly, the source also emphasizes that for many others in this searcher group, this period of intense exploration, even with its uncertainty, is actually a healthy, productive route towards personal growth and self-discovery. So not all searching is distressed searching.
Got it.
Yeah.
Path makers, searchers.
Then you have the guardians. These individuals show relatively stable, moderate scores across all the dimensions over time. But crucially, they tend to be relatively closed to new options lower on exploration and breadth, and they don't explore their current commitments very deeply, either lower on exploration in depth.
Sounds like foreclosure from Marcy's model.
Yeah, it resembles that more rigid foreclosure status. Latching onto values or choices adopted from others without much prior exploration or later evaluation. They might react defensively if their commitments are questioned. They also often show that elevated default individualization, kind of following a life course, dictated more by circumstance or others' expectations than active choice.
Okay, guardians. One more.
Yep, the consolidators. This is a really interesting trajectory highlighted by this detailed model. They are typically high and increasing on commitment making. They are making firm choices. However, they score relatively low on exploration and breadth.
So they didn't search widely first.
Seems like it. But importantly, they score high and stable on exploration in depth and identification with commitment. Once they've made their choices, their main identity work is evaluating and strengthening those existing commitments, and they feel a strong sense of certainty and fit with them.
Ah, so they commit early, maybe without a huge search, but then they really dig into it and identify with it.
Exactly. They resemble what some researchers called an open foreclosure committed early, but flexible and willing to evaluate in depth, and they identify strongly. This group also tends to show moderate to high well-being.
Wow, these trajectories, pathmakers, searchers, guardians, consolidators, they really sound like distinct ways people navigate their 20s and beyond.
Yeah.
Pathmakers intentionally building, guardians holding on to what they were given, searchers still finding their footing, some okay, some struggling, and consolidators refining a path they started early.
That's a helpful way to think about them. And these trajectories are being studied in relation to longer-term outcomes, connecting back to ideas about development across the lifespan. The source mentions things like the continuity hypothesis. Maybe early struggles or successes tend to persist.
Okay.
The rebound hypothesis, maybe early struggles are temporary, people can catch up. And the sleeper effect hypothesis, maybe the benefits of early work, like thorough exploration, only show up later in life.
Interesting long-term questions.
Yeah. The source suggests path makers and consolidators, with their higher well-being, might show favorable long-term adjustment, supporting that continuity idea for positive paths. But maybe consolidators' lower breadth exploration means they don't update their identity as much later on compared to path makers, who might be more adaptable to big life changes. These are active research areas. The research also digs into what factors influence these identity processes, the antecedents, and what important outcomes they lead to the consequences and correlates. And it highlights a really fascinating concept, an interdependent personality identity system.
Interdependent, meaning they affect each other.
Exactly. Your personality traits, like how introverted or extroverted, organized, open to new things you are, they influence how you approach identity work. And significantly, it seems to go the other way too. The process of doing identity work, exploring, committing, evaluating, can actually influence and potentially change aspects of your personality over time.
Personality shapes identity, and identity shapes personality. That's a truly dynamic two-way street. Okay, here's where it gets really interesting.
It really is. The source mentions specific findings from longitudinal studies showing these reciprocal influences. For example, neuroticism, that tendency towards negative emotions like anxiety, worry, instability,
Okay.
that was negatively related to forming and identifying with commitments. Which makes sense, right? If you worry a lot, it's hard to feel certain and committed.
Sure.
But maybe surprisingly, neuroticism was positively related to exploration and breadth.
More worry, more broad searching. Why?
The source suggests maybe worrying makes you dwell excessively on all the different possibilities and pitfalls, leading to this prolonged, maybe anxious search through options.
Oh, okay. What else?
Openness to experience, being curious, imaginative, willing to try new things, that was consistently positively related to exploration overall, both breadth and depth, which fits, right? Open people explore more.
Makes sense.
And conscientiousness, being organized, disciplined, responsible, goal-oriented, that was found to influence and be influenced by the ability to form and identify with commitments.
How so?
Well, being conscientious might give you the drive to pursue identity goals, stick with the work, feel good about choices. And conversely, successfully making and sticking to meaningful commitments might actually boost your sense of conscientiousness and competence.
So it builds on itself.
Yeah. The source explicitly says identity and personality seem to develop as part of this continuously interacting system. Doing the work of identity can actually prompt personality maturation. And beyond personality, the family environment, especially parenting style, plays a big role. The source highlights the impact of psychological control.
Psychological control. What does that mean exactly?
It's described as parenting that intrudes on or impedes a young person's autonomy and individuality, often through things like guilt trips, manipulation, making love conditional on choices, or invalidating their feelings or independent decisions.
Oof, not good.
Definitely not. The source links perceived intrusive psychological control from parents during these emerging adult years to difficulties in establishing clear, committed identity choices over time.
So if a parent is overly controlling, manipulative, making their kid feel guilty for wanting independence, it makes it harder for that young person to truly explore authentically, make their own choices, or feel genuinely good about the commitments they eventually make. They might struggle with commitment making, and especially identification with commitment.
Yes, that's exactly what the research points to. Young adults who felt their parents used intrusive control had trouble making clear commitments, and even if they did make choices, they were significantly less likely to identify with those commitments, to feel that certainty and personal expression.
That's tough.
And here's that reciprocal thing again. The source found that if a young person continued extensive exploration in breadth over time, it could actually increase perceived parental psychological control.
Wait, exploring more makes parents more controlling. Why would that happen?
The researchers suggest maybe parents, seeing their child still exploring rather than settling down into a clear path, feel anxious or uncertain about their future. They might interpret that prolonged exploration negatively and respond by trying to exert more control, maybe pressuring them to pick something or settle down.
Oh, wrong.
And that increased parental pressure can then further interfere with the young person's own autonomous identity work, making it even harder for them to make genuine, self-endorsed commitments. It can become this really challenging cycle.
That cycle sounds incredibly difficult to break. And thinking about this as someone going into elementary education, thinking about the huge influence parents have right from the start, understanding these dynamics, even how they play out later, feels incredibly important. You see the roots of needing autonomy and the potential harm of controlling behavior way earlier.
Absolutely.
It makes fostering that sense of agency, supporting kids' emerging independence right from the start, seem even more crucial when you understand the long-term implications for identity.
Absolutely. While your elementary students aren't navigating identity exploration and commitment in the same complex way as college students, those fundamental building blocks, feeling a sense of autonomy, having chances to make age-appropriate choices, feeling competent, having supportive relationships, those are all laying the groundwork for later healthy identity development. Recognizing the long-term impact of supportive versus controlling environments really highlights why creating nurturing environments that foster these qualities is so vital from the earliest years. Now, one of the major contributions, and it may be one of the most impactful findings from research using this updated five-dimensional model, is the distinction between different qualities of exploration. Remember, we mentioned that exploration, especially prolonged searching, can sometimes be linked to distress.
Yeah, for some of the searchers.
Right. The source dives into this by differentiating between ruminative exploration and more adaptive forms like reflective exploration.
Ruminative exploration, that phrase itself sounds like getting stuck, just going over and over the same thoughts without getting anywhere.
That's exactly it. Ruminative exploration is described as a negative, chronic, persistent focus on the self and one's identity options, often motivated by fear, anxiety, uncertainty, or perceived threats, rather than genuine curiosity. It's dwelling on choices or lack of choices in this worried, unproductive loop.
Like worrying constantly about the future.
Yeah, the source gives examples like items measuring, I keep wondering which direction my life has to take, or I worry about what I want to do with my future. It contrasts sharply with reflective exploration, which is more adaptive, positive, driven by genuine interest in understanding yourself and your options, and leads to more active processing and progress.
So like brooding versus constructive thinking.
Exactly. That distinction exists in general psychology, and this model applies that crucial idea specifically to identity exploration. And just like brooding is linked to negative outcomes, ruminative exploration is strongly linked to lower self-esteem and higher depression and anxiety in emerging adults. And crucially, it acts as an obstacle. It actually inhibits commitment making and identification with commitment over time.
Why? How does it inhibit commitment?
Because you're so caught up in anxiously worrying about making the wrong choice or feeling uncertain that you struggle to actually make choices at all or to feel good about the ones you tentatively make. The worry paralyzes progress.
So it's not just whether you explore, but how you explore, the quality of that internal process that matters profoundly for your psychological well-being and your ability to actually move forward in forming and feeling secure in your identity.
Exactly. The source even suggests that the complexities of modern life, so many choices, maybe less clear traditional paths, might contribute to some young people getting stuck in this ruminative cycle. And adding this dimension of ruminative exploration helps clarify some things that were maybe less clear with just Marcia's statuses. For example, when using this five-dimensional model, the moratorium cluster, those intent searchers, often scores high on ruminative exploration, along with breadth and depth.
So moratorium isn't always just healthy searching.
It suggests that for many classified as moratorium, it might represent more of an arrested, distressed state. They're struggling to move forward because of chronic worry and indecision, not just openly exploring. Similarly, diffusion, low exploration, low commitment isn't just one thing, according to this model. Studies found two distinct subtypes, carefree diffusion and diffuse diffusion.
Carefree versus diffuse diffusion.
Yeah. The diffuse diffusion group scores high on ruminative exploration and shows maladjustment, depression, anxiety, kind of like that distress moratorium, but with less active exploration overall. But the carefree diffusion group seems relatively untroubled by their lack of commitment or exploration. They score low on rumination and generally don't report psychological distress.
Carefree diffusion, that sounds potentially more worrying in a different way, precisely because they aren't bothered by lacking direction or engagement. Does that imply maybe a lack of future orientation or concern for consequences?
It can be, yes. And this is where the practical implications really hit home, even thinking foundationally. The source links carefree diffusion to significantly higher rates of various health-compromising behaviors in large studies of college students.
Like what kind of behaviors?
Things like illicit drug use, hazardous alcohol use, unsafe sex, riding with drunk drivers. This identity status seems linked to a striking lack of consideration for the future or potential risks. They seem to prioritize present-oriented, potentially dangerous behaviors, maybe because they haven't engaged with building a meaningful identity or future path, or considering long-term consequences.
Wow. That powerfully highlights how these different ways of navigating identity can have very real-world, sometimes very serious consequences, way beyond just feeling good or bad psychologically.
Absolutely. And the distinction between achievement and foreclosure also becomes clearer with these dimensions. Achieved individuals score higher not just on adaptive exploration, but significantly higher on identification with commitment. They didn't just choose, they feel that strong sense of certainty and fit. Foreclosed individuals, while they have commitments, typically score lower on exploration, especially breadth, and significantly lower on identification with commitment compared to achieved folks. They might have a career or values, but they feel less immersed, less involved, less autonomous, maybe less enthusiastic about them, potentially because they didn't do that self-directed exploration first.
So the commitment might be there, but the personal connection isn't as strong for foreclosure.
Generally, yes. Though the source notes foreclosed individuals often report moderate well-being, maybe because the commitments provide some structure, even if not deeply authentic. And while our focus is on your stage and future career, the source does mention this LEX model has been applied successfully to other groups too, beyond students.
Like who?
Employed adults, for instance. Commitment making was linked to feeling subjectively like an adult. And different identity statuses related to things like job burnout and engagement. Achieved individuals were more engaged, saw work as a calling. Foreclosed workers might see it more as just a job, less absorbed, even if not totally burnt out. Diffusion was linked to higher burnout.
Okay, so it matters in the workplace.
Yeah, and it's even been studied in people with chronic illness, like type 1 diabetes. Research suggests having a strong sense of identity, particularly being able to explore in depth and identify with commitments related to managing their health, seems to be a really important internal resource for coping and integrating the illness adaptively into their self-view.
This really drives home that identity development isn't just some academic concept for the college years. It's a lifelong process that plays out in critical areas like work, health, navigating major challenges all through adulthood.
And finally, the source just hints at some of the really cutting-edge research happening now, looking at identity processes not just over years, but daily. Capturing those microprocesses in real time.
Daily identity checks?
Sort of. Studies show commitment and reconsideration of commitment fluctuate day to day and influence each other. And interestingly, having large day-to-day fluctuations in how much you reconsider your commitments, feeling sure one day, doubtful the next, that instability can actually predict future distress, like depression and anxiety, and lower overall commitment levels later on.
Wow, so it's not just big life phases, but even our daily experiences and internal wobbles can chip away at or strengthen our sense of identity. It's this constant dynamic process right down to the micro level. It's a powerful thought. So we've taken a pretty substantial deep dive here into personal identity development, really guided by the insights from Lyax and his colleagues in that source chapter. We started with the foundations, Erikson's big picture, Marcia's statuses, then moved through those more dynamic process models, looking at formation and evaluation. And we spent a good chunk of time unpacking those 5 key dimensions: exploration and breadth, commitment making, exploration and depth, identification with commitment, and that really crucial addition of ruminative exploration. We explored the different developmental trajectories people seem to follow: pathmakers, searchers, guardians, consolidators. We looked at the influence of things like personality and parenting, that reciprocal relationship. And we even touched on how identity plays out daily and in different contexts like work or health. And it's linked to really important outcomes like well-being and even risk behaviors.
Yeah, this research, drawing from our source, it really paints a picture of identity development not as a one-off event, but as this complex, dynamic, largely lifelong process, though definitely with particularly intense phases during adolescence and emerging adulthood. And as a university student, maybe heading into elementary education, you are right in the thick of this personally.
Definitely feels like it sometimes.
Right. You're likely actively engaged in exploration and commitment processes related to your studies, your future career, your evolving values, your worldview. Understanding this detailed framework, it can give you language and insight into your own journey right now. Recognizing your own patterns, are you exploring broadly, digging deeper? How are you evaluating your commitments, like your major choice? And being aware of potential pitfalls, like getting stuck in that ruminative worry. It helps normalize what can be a challenging process.
Yeah, having names for these things helps. And importantly, while the research here focuses mostly on older groups, knowing how identity develops seems like it provides an absolutely invaluable lens for your future role as an elementary teacher.
I think so too.
Your students, they're very young, but they're at the very beginning of their journeys of self-discovery, exploring the world and their place in it. And even though they aren't forming identity in the same complex, explicit way emerging adults are, understanding the underlying processes that mature later seems key.
What kind of processes are you thinking of?
Well, the importance of safe exploration, right?
Yeah.
The huge influence of others, parents, peers, and yes, you as their teacher. The idea of evaluating how well something fits, even if it's just a skill or an interest, feeling a sense of competence and belonging, these feel like the fundamental building blocks that start right there in elementary school and lay the groundwork for all that later identity work we've been talking about.
That's a great connection. The source mentions that interventions targeting by understanding the whole trajectory of identity development, you gain insight into the long game. You see how the environment you create, the opportunities you offer for exploration, even simple exploration of interests or activities, the support you provide for developing competence and making small choices. It all contributes to that complex process of identity formation that your students will continue for decades. And the research really shows identity isn't just about finding a label or picking a career. It's deeply linked to our overall well-being, how effectively we cope with challenges throughout life, how engaged and purposeful we feel. So considering all these different ways people navigate identity, from those who proactively shape their path and feel deeply identified, like pathmakers, to those who feel stuck in worry, like diffuse diffusion, or passively follow others, like guardians, what does this tell us about the incredible diversity of needs, challenges, and strengths your future students will bring as they grow? And maybe the final thought for you, as a future educator present at such crucial formative stages, how might understanding this complexity, this intricate, lifelong process of forming, evaluating, revising the self shape your approach? How can we best nurture the potential of the next generation, recognizing that their journey of self-discovery is vital, dynamic, and will continue long, long after they leave our classrooms? It's something powerful to think about as you embark on your own path and prepare to guide others on theirs.